Hello and welcome to Horns of a Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review, TNSR. I'm Doyle Hodges, Executive Editor of TNSR. In this episode of Horns, we listen into a conversation between Paul Edgar, the Executive Director of the Clements Center at the University of Texas, Austin, and retired General David Petraeus, currently serving as the Director of the KKR Global Institute. The conversation is wide-ranging, but it addresses principally the challenge posed by China and challenges facing U.S. national security after the Trump administration. Let's listen in.
My name is Paul Edgar. I'll facilitate our conversation today with General David Petraeus. So now let me introduce our distinguished guest with a few highlights of his bio, and then I'll offer a very short anecdote. General David Petraeus is a partner with the global investment firm KKR and chairman of the KKR Global Institute. He is also a member of the boards of directors of Optiv and First Stream. He's a venture investor, and he is also engaged in a variety of academic endeavors. Prior to joining KKR, General Petraeus served over 37 years in the U.S. military, culminating his career with 6 consecutive commands, 5 of which were in combat, including the 101st Airborne Division, Multinational Forces Iraq during the surge, U.S. Central Command, and International Security Assistance Force, the highest command of coalition forces in Afghanistan, which also coincided with our surge there. Following retirement from the military, he served as director of the CIA, his most senior position to date in public service. So those are just a few highlights from a very distinguished biography. And if I may, let me take another minute to provide a little color commentary by describing my first snapshot of General Petraeus. I think it was March or April of 2004, and I may be off by a few weeks, but it was right about that time, spring 2004. I was in the courtyard of Saddam Hussein's Republican Palace in Baghdad, which at the time essentially served as our embassy and the center of our provisional government, the headquarters for Ambassador Paul Bremer and his coalition provisional authority where I was working. While crossing the courtyard, I noticed an entourage of staff and a personal security detachment following behind 2 general officers, one of whom was moving very directly and very quickly. Everyone else was clearly trying to keep up. I could tell that this was a high-energy leader. By then, I knew most of the senior civilian and military leaders in Iraq. Major General Paul Eaton was one of the generals, but I didn't recognize this other general next to him who exuded energy and purpose. And I was too far away to read the name tape on his uniform. So after the entourage passed, I asked around about who it was, and I learned then that it was Major General at the time, Petraeus. And at that time, he was, in fact, still in command of the 101st, which had only recently left Mosul and northern Iraq and went back to Fort Campbell, Kentucky. But by his request, he came back to Iraq almost immediately in order to prepare for his next job, commanding our headquarters that was responsible for recruiting, training, and equipping Iraqi security forces. That was my first impression of General Petraeus. It lasted less than a minute. But this is what I walked away thinking. This guy is serious about winning in a way that most people are not. He knows how much effort is required to win in a way that many people do not. And he's willing to put forth that effort. He's even willing to make immense personal sacrifices to do what his country has asked him to do. General Petraeus, welcome, and thanks so much for joining us today.
Well, it's great to be with you, Paul. Thanks to you. Thanks to the Clements Center. Thanks to the University of Texas. Thanks above all to TRS, a hugely important partner for KKR. And thanks, frankly, for your own time in uniform, especially in Iraq and Afghanistan. Although I should note, with great respect, I wasn't back in Iraq at my request while still commanding the 101st Airborne Division. I was back there at the request of Donald Rumsfeld, who asked me to go over and to try to determine what had happened in this particular period of uprising of both the insurgents and the Shia militia that you'll recall was called March Madness in 2004, where the Iraqi security forces that we had tried to train so far with a pretty haphazard effort, frankly, had failed in virtually all the places except back up in the 101st Airborne Division area in Mosul, where they had done pretty well. And he wanted to asked me to determine what it was that transpired, why ours did better than the others, and what needed to be done for the overall effort to reform the so-called train and equip mission, which I did then. My reward for doing that particular assessment, after I went back and reported to him and gave him the briefing and gave 8 or 10 recommendations, he said, "Terrific, get back to Iraq and implement those recommendations." So that's really how that came. But it's also kind of you to note that there was a competitive bone in my body. You're not the first to have noted that indeed there is a bit of a competitive streak. And I think actually in life, life is actually a competitive endeavor. You really don't get trophies just for showing up in most endeavors out there. And it's, I think, a life lesson to remember that, again, if you just can't be proud to be average in life, you really have to commit and you really do have to compete, noting that you should compete to be the best team player as well as the best individual. And finally, one final comment. You may occasionally hear some enthusiastic barking in the background here. The family dog has very strong views on some of the issues that we'll discuss, and she will note that with her emphasis by barking.
Well, she's very welcome as well. So many people are familiar with parts or maybe even all of your biography, but many people are probably unfamiliar with your current role. So as by way of introduction, can you tell us a little bit about KKR and your role there as
Sure.
a partner and chairman of the KKR's Global Institute?
You bet. So KKR has been around for 42 years or so. Arguably, Henry Kravis and George Roberts, 2 of the 3 co-founders, really established the private equity industry as we know it today. Although, frankly, we are way beyond just a private equity firm at this point in time. We invest in every assets, including not just the traditional private equity industries, but also real assets, real estate, energy, infrastructure. We do growth stage, not venture capital, but growth technology investing. And we're very, very big now in the credit and capital markets. So we can originate our own debt. We can take our own companies public and all the rest of this. We have about $340 billion under management. We own about 110 companies around the world, and we have minority investments in another 70 or 80. Henry Kravis asked me to join the firm about 8 years ago to establish the KKR Global Institute, the intent of which is to help KKR be the wisest investor that we can possibly be.
Right.
We do this by bringing together the analysis of 3 different groups: the geopolitical risk team, which I head, the macroeconomic analysis team, which an individual named Henry McVeigh heads, and then the environmental social governance issues analysis team headed by Ken Melman. All of those are integrated and then provided together with what the deal team provides to the investment committees that cover different geographic regions of the world and then also different industry types. And so that's really the primary responsibility is to ensure that, again, we are making investments not just with the financial bottom line in mind, but also with these other risks identified, analyzed, and where possible, recommendations for mitigating those risks laid out as well. And frankly, we have vetoed several deals over the course of the 8 years I've been with the firm, some of which others really wanted to do because of their financial attraction, but which we convinced the investment committee should not be done for a variety of different issues involving perhaps reputational risk, potential Foreign Corrupt Practices Act violations, and some other issues that arose during the diligence process. Beyond that, we work very hard to help our portfolio companies, the companies that we own or which we have a minority investment. We do much more of that than I thought would be the case, even in very developed countries at various times, because of issues that arise and where, frankly, I or perhaps sometimes Henry Kravis or others can get attention to these issues in a way that the team on the ground may not be possible to achieve. And then finally, we do a great deal with our limited partners, particularly our so-called strategic partners, of which TRS is foremost among them, I should note. These are investment elements that have made substantial investments with KKR over a very long period of time, and we believe have worked out very well for them, or frankly, they wouldn't still be with us. And we work very hard to help all of our investors, but particularly our strategic partners, to understand the world in which we are all trying to invest together. And frankly, during that 8-year period, the geopolitical risk component and these other components have become far more important in the investment process than they were just 8 years ago because of the increasing complexity of the world, because of new trends, and frankly, because of the resurgence of so-called great power rivalries, great power competition that we see that has brought about a variety of different government actions that you've truly got to understand before you make an investment in a company that touches in some of those areas.
That's actually a terrific segue into our first couple of questions. Once again, the United States is confronted by challenges on its Atlantic side and the Pacific side. And we could divide up the globe differently, but I'll leave it at that. And these are challenges of a different nature and perhaps a different order, but competing challenges nonetheless. The United States likes to play what we might say it likes to play away games to keep our adversaries or problems far from our shores. And we've had relatively unhindered access to most of the world in recent decades. Is that going to change? And what ought we do about it? For example, should the U.S. do something that we are not already doing to ensure that we can maintain that kind of access and project power into, for example, the Indo-Pacific?
First of all, I think it's very important to note the way the current administration would answer that question, because I think that what they would say is that to play an effective away game, we first have to do some very serious work on our home game. Needless to say, we must confront the pandemic. We must defeat it. We must help others in the world defeat it as well, because, of course, no one of us is safe until all of us are safe with this kind of threat. We've got to bring ourselves economically out of the post-pandemic economic shutdown. Again, certainly there have been major winners during this time, but there have also been serious segments of the economy, most particularly tourism, travel, hospitality, large entertainment, et cetera. We've got to revive a variety of different industries after helping them get through what still will be many, many months before we're able to return to what actually will be a new normal. We're not going to totally return to the old normal. There will be changes in how we behave, how we, again, work, live, play, all the rest of this. But we've got to get that right. And I think you have to be honest and forthright that some of the divisions that exist in our country, the very hyper-partisanship in Washington in particular, that has made it difficult to achieve compromise on various important legislation, some of that has to be resolved as well. And that we can't really play the role on the world stage. We can't play effectively in the away games if we haven't, again, solidified what we are doing here. That's particularly important if we note that in many respects, what we're engaged in now together with our Western democratic and capitalist economic partners around the world is a bit of a competition with a different system.
Right.
You may recall there was a famous article written by Francis Fukuyama back in 1989. It was called The End of History. It really became a classic in its time because he predicted correctly that within a year or two, the Soviet Union was going to collapse. And he described history as a competition between two different systems. Again, the US-led Western democratically elected system of governance and free market economics, and the Soviet Communist Party and the command economy, a socialist economy essentially controlled by government rather than the allocation of resources by markets. And he predicted correctly that this was going to collapse of its own weight, and it did. And we had the unipolar moment where the U.S. stood astride the world unchallenged. But there is a different system. And to be absolutely fair to that system, that of China, the Chinese Communist Party has demonstrated extraordinary facility at governing. Again, different system, lack of freedoms that many of us cherish, to be sure. But what they have achieved economically with a so-called state capitalism form, hyper competition in the market part of it, but still state-owned enterprises in that ecosystem. But what they have achieved in the 41 or 42 years since Deng Xiaoping welcomed the world to China is beyond what any country ever has achieved, especially a large country. And so there's a competition of systems ongoing. And in that regard, clearly, we have to get our own system performing at, hitting on all cylinders together with those of our like-minded allies and partners around the world if we're to deal effectively, again, in this most important relationship in the world, which is that between the U.S. and China. I've often likened what a superpower has to do, what the U.S. has to do, to that of the guy in the circus who keeps a lot of plates spinning. Remember, he gets one up, and he gets it spinning, then he goes over, he gets another, and he keeps going around. He'll come back to give him just to keep them all going. And amazingly, you'll have 10, 12, 15 plates spinning on sticks all simultaneously. That's what a superpower has to do. But make no mistake about it, the plate that represents the U.S.-China relationship is not just bigger, the biggest of all the plates. It is arguably bigger than all of the others. And this clearly is the most important relationship, again, not just for our two countries, but for all the countries of the world, given the significance of the Chinese market, both as an export destination for so many of our partners and allies, but also, frankly, as a source of imports for us among many, many others. Let's keep in mind that the U.S. and China were each other's biggest trading partners prior to the imposition of the tariffs, but it still is one of the top three, as always, together with Canada and Mexico, with whom we obviously have a trade partnership of longstanding duration. So again, to do that effectively, you've got to get things straight here at home. And that is really why the president, why the Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, why the National Security Advisor and so forth, why they have all emphasized that foreign policy really does begin at home, because that's the foundation for what it is for the projection of our power in all different manifestations throughout the world.
So let's turn to China. China's, you've mentioned it, China's economic influence in the Indo-Pacific region continues to grow, as you've mentioned. Even in bad years, it grows. And China seems increasingly willing to use that influence. Will U.S. alliances based on military cooperation and security guarantees be enough to counter this, or is there more?
It will not be enough. And again, I don't want to sound at all. I am truly nonpartisan. I don't register. I don't endorse candidates, contribute. I will advise candidates of either party. And I've been this way. I stopped registering when I was promoted to 2 stars to try to be truly apolitical, which I think is hugely important to those in uniform. And arguably, I'd say even for those who were in uniform at very high levels, because it makes life difficult for those who are still in uniform if the retirees are all very active. So that said, our military activities are by no means going to be enough. And what this administration, again, is putting forward actually is what I called for several years ago in a monograph at Harvard's Belfer Center, where I was a fellow for 6 years, and called for a coherent and comprehensive policy for China. Coherent means that every action you take in foreign policy, not just military, but diplomatic, trade, economic, you name it, informational, whatever the activity is, it is filtered through a prism which asks, what will the effect of this action be on the U.S.-China relationship, to make sure, again, that they're all pulling in the same direction. Then comprehensive, because you want it to be whole of government. In military is by no means enough. You need all of the other tools involved and engaged, and all pulling, again, simultaneously and effectively toward the same objective. But it's more than that. There's more. You want it to be whole of governments with an S on the end, so that all of our partners and allies and so forth are all engaged in this with us to amplify the effectiveness of our efforts to try, for example, to perhaps influence some of the decisions made in Beijing, noting that there will be areas we very much should engage, and that engagement has already begun to our call between the president of the U.S. and the president of China. Other engagements at other levels already ongoing. There will be areas of cooperation. Certainly, countering the pandemic should be foremost among them, but also actions to mitigate the challenges of climate change. Also, perhaps counterterrorism would be another one. There's a variety of different where we have similar objectives that we can pursue together. There will be areas of competition without question in a whole variety of different realms. And there will be areas where there is the potential for confrontation, where our core interests are in conflict. And in those cases, we have to be very, very careful to deter those actions from taking place by, again, that is where the military, but also all the other tools come to play. And the adversary in a situation of deterrence, you achieve deterrence by the adversary assessing that you have the capabilities and the will to employ those capabilities in such a sufficient fashion that you probably should not contemplate doing what might bring those into play. And I think that's an accurate depiction of what is actually going on and the way that they are going about this. With the National Security Advisor orchestrating all of this, and with all of the different departments playing a role, but all of them doing it together, harnessed in the interest of this achieving the objectives that have been established for this most critical relationship in the world. I should note that no one, as you would appreciate, no one wants to see this relationship be mutually beneficial than those who have seen what happens when relations are not mutually beneficial. The cost, the sacrifice, et cetera, would be incalculable in this case. And we absolutely must seek to avoid the kind of conflict that could result.
Well, let's turn in the other direction, towards the Atlantic, for a moment, for one question. President Biden has attempted to convince allies on that side of us, on the Atlantic side, that the United States is back in its role as a unifying leader. But there are still deep divisions within the NATO alliance. France wants more autonomy within Europe. Turkey isn't sure necessarily if it's part of Europe or not. The southern and eastern NATO allies have different perceptions of threats. Are there steps that you think the administration can take to overcome these kinds of divisions and the problems that we face over there, the challenges that we face over there?
Certainly there are. Just again, reassuring that we will not pull our forces out of Germany or out of NATO, that our commitment to NATO remains, and a variety of other areas that have already actually been put forward, I think, are very important. But at the end of the day, it's going to take a period of time, and it's going to be deeds, not words. Again, it is very easy to say things during a campaign. Then when you're actually in office, as we have seen with some very recent situations where the campaign promises or pledges turned out to be a good bit more than was realistic when you actually confront, again, a particular situation. So it is going to take time. And certainly there are some bruises from the previous administration, which, in my view, rightly chided the NATO allies who did not spend the 2% of GDP on defense that they'd committed to spend during a summit at Wales some years ago, back during the Obama administration. Again, all those leaders committed to that. And I mean, one very significant, the biggest economic power in Europe is not even at 1.5% yet. That's a legitimate concern. Now, you can also, though, ask, did we need to be quite as brusque or harsh in that criticism and some of the other activities that we took, including some of the trade issues? Again, there are legitimate concerns and challenges here that we're going to have to work through, even as there is a reassurance of a recommitment to NATO and an embrace of alliances and partnerships again, and a softening of the America first, noting that, look, every country puts its own country first. But again, whether you need to rhetorically remind everyone of that quite so prominently, I think is what is in question. So again, that NATO alliance is the most important, the most significant in history, having been privileged to lead NATO forces as a 1-star, 3-star, and 4-star. I can tell you that Winston Churchill was absolutely right when he said that the only thing worse than fighting with allies is fighting without them. There is a lot of effort that goes into alliance and coalition management. It is not easy work. It is very frustrating, as is dealing with international organizations and a variety of other, again, partners and allies around the world. But at the end of the day, it is very much worth it. And we are seeing that in the early weeks, the early months now of this new administration.
Right. It is a trick to balance those things, but it's incredibly important. You started your comments about the international scene by focusing on the domestic. Let's look a little bit more closely, perhaps, at one of those. Civil-military relations in the United States have been a hot topic for a while now, but especially with the nomination and confirmation of retired General Lloyd Austin as the new Secretary of Defense. Your relationship with Ambassador Ryan Crocker, and I can think of many other things as well, but your relationship with him has been hailed as a model of civil-military cooperation. What made that relationship work? And are there lessons in that other civilian and military leaders today could take from your experience?
First of all, I probably just should note that I was privileged to soldier with Lloyd Austin on 3 or 4 occasions and to be his boss on at least 2 or 3 of those. He was, in the second half of the surge in Iraq, the 3-star multinational corps commander, the operational commander, as I was the strategic commander. He was later the strategic commander in Iraq when I was at Central Command or CIA. And prior to that, we served together in the 82nd Airborne when I was a 1-star and he was a colonel. And again, I think an accurate description of him to say that he is brilliantly solid, even in really tough circumstances like the Battle of Basra in March and April of 2008, when we had this enormous fight down there and the Iraqis had gone off on their own to do it, and a unilateral decision by the prime minister, not consulting me and not holding it up until we could establish conditions that would have ensured that they would prevail. And it was actually a close run thing. He got down there, he moved his entire tactical command post down there so that we could bring all the assets over the battlefield that we needed to support them and get advisors hooked up with these teams, et cetera, because the British command that was down there responsible for that area didn't have the equipment that enabled us to connect all of these feeds that are coming in from drones, aircraft, other enablers that we're providing to the Iraqis. He did it very calmly, very quickly, very coolly. There was no drama. And he did it brilliantly. And I think that's the kind of Secretary of Defense that we have now, frankly. So despite the fact that he had not been out of the service for the requisite 6 years and required that waiver from Congress, I thought they were wise to give that. And again, he did have a relationship with the vice president when President Biden was vice president. That was really quite close because the vice president had Iraq as its portfolio, as Lloyd was the final 4-star there, and also when the vice president's son was serving in Iraq. Came to the relationship with Ambassador Ryan Crocker, who I believe is the greatest diplomat of his generation, certainly the greatest for the greater Middle Eastern region. Look, we recognized from the beginning that, to come back to what we were talking about earlier, that military activity was necessary, but not sufficient. Yes, we had to achieve better security, and the military had to do that together with some interagency partners, but predominantly done by the military of conventional and special operations forces. And U.S. had to take the lead because the Iraqi forces could no longer perform the tasks necessary. They'd been beaten so badly by this near civil war that was ongoing in the country. When there are 53 dead civilian bodies every 24 hours on the streets of a country's capital due to violence, you know that the situation is out of control. And that's what Baghdad was prior to the start of the surge. So both of us recognized that we were being brought in, frankly, to retrieve a failing situation. And we recognized that you had to have a completely integrated civil military whole of government approach. And we actually did a civil military campaign plan. In fact, I used to take a little bit of heat from some of the folks above me for having, quote, civilian crap in my campaign plan. I said, well, this is because it is a civil military plan. It needs to be integrated, and we will oversee this together. And we literally linked arms like that. We had offices in that palace that you just described, which was by then the embassy, where we had a common waiting room. I mean, we did have our own offices, but we had a common waiting room. We saw each other multiple times during each day. Just about every time that we saw the prime minister or saw visiting congressional delegations or senior leaders from the United States, we always did it together so that there never could be any kind of confusion about, well, he said, and then he said. It was always, again, united. And we sought to present a united front in all that we did, in everything, all the way up to the quarterly campaign plan review and assessment that was done every 3 months, and which was such a big effort. You had all the major generals and the other ambassadors and other countries' ambassadors, people from Central Command, from the Pentagon, from Washington, the White House, who all come out for this. But we sat at the table together and we orchestrated it together, as we did with everything that we pursued. And it was actually my initiative to ask that he come back to Washington with me at the 6-month mark. During my confirmation hearing, I had the pledge that I would return at 6 months and testify as to the state of the campaign in Iraq. Because again, the Senate was only one vote away from cloture, which could have constrained or perhaps even defunded the war effort. So this was very, very significant. I went back at the 3-month mark to do a closed door testimony, and everybody showed up for that. I mean, literally 97 senators or something. So it wasn't just committees, it was the entire House and Senate that wanted to come. And they assigned me, as you always do if you're military, with a variety of other people. So we had the Undersecretary of Defense, I think, for policy. We had the Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and we had the Deputy Secretary of State. But the fact was, I knew more than supposedly what they should have been talking about, because I was actually executing it. So I thought what we need to do is the two of us go back together and do just as we've done everything else. We do it together, recognizing that meant that each of us had to take on 2 additional committees. Normally, I would have done the House and Senate Armed Services Committees. He would have done just the House and Senate Foreign Relations Committees. If we do it together, we have to add those 2 for each of us. This was a marathon over a 2-day period it was very, very rugged, but it was worth it. And we did it again 6 months later, and then really never had to do it again after that. So that kind of approach is crucial. And I think it absolutely has lessons for what we were talking about earlier, that what we should pursue is a comprehensive, coherent whole of governments with an S on the end. So it's not even all of our civil and military capabilities. It's all of those of our allies and partners that we can possibly put together as well. That's really critical. And that kind of approach, I think, is absolutely essential. You can't have the military, even though without security, nothing else is going to be possible. The military has to recognize that that security foundation is solidified by what you build on top of that. And that is in a host of other realms, everything from the reestablishment of the rule of law to the repair of damaged infrastructure, the restoration of basic services, the reestablishment of local, provincial, and national governance, the passage of legislation in the Council of Representatives, you name it. It goes on and on. To be fair, and Ambassador Crocker would be the first to acknowledge this, we did not achieve, particularly in the political realm, all that we had hoped to achieve. Right. But we achieved a lot. And of course, none of it would have been possible without that security foundation and without the comprehensive approach that we embrace.
There's so many directions I would like to take that about how we have a whole of government approach to many things. Cyber, the great power competition that we referred to, so many things. But I think right now it might be good to transition to our TRS audience and ask a couple of questions that may engage them a little bit more. but also certainly of interest to those associated with the KKR and the Clements Center. So the next two questions, they deal with education and mentorship. You've got a terrific academic resume as well. So first, TRS is made up largely of educators, or at least they serve educators. Education played a prominent role in your life and your career. Can you share your thoughts with us about the role of the academy, higher education or K through 12 or both, in shaping and improving public service in your experience?
Well, I think that what prepares one for serving, perhaps in any endeavor, but certainly in government, are three components, typically. One is the formal education that is undertaken for that particular pursuit. So the military is the most hierarchical and structured, where you have pre-commissioned training and education. You have a basic course. A few years after that, you have an advanced course. Then there's a staff college and a work college, all the way on up. So that's that element of that. And you have varying degrees of that, usually much, much less, but still important in any other endeavor. You have the general education, which is, again, your civilian education, which I think is just absolutely of paramount importance, because it gives you the skills, the basic skills, the analytical, the writing, the speaking, all of this, and a body of knowledge, typically with some expertise that is specific for what it is you're going to do. And then, of course, you have the actual experience of doing it and your career progression. And I think all of those are typically combined. But I have to say that in my case, going to a civilian graduate school was a completely out of my intellectual comfort zone experience, in part because the military, like some other endeavors, often succumbs to what an old boss of mine used to call the grindstone cloister syndrome. This is that you have your nose to the grindstone, you're working really, really hard. In fact, it's almost cultural that you should always start early and stay late.
Right.
And you have a sort of a cloistered experience where you're only interacting with folks. You think you're having big debates, but it turns out they're sort of like this instead of like this. And frankly, when I went to grad school, I mean, the debates were like that. It wasn't just, should we have 100 MX missiles or 200? It was, should we have any at all? Should we even have nuclear weapons? Should we have no first use? Should we, what are the assumptions about the state of nature? Again, what would mankind be in the absence of the Leviathan, to refer to Hobbes, so forth? So, look, I just found that of unbelievable value. And indeed, when I was confronted with the biggest challenges of my military career, probably beginning in Mosul in Iraq, when I arrive up there and I'm by the Geneva Convention, an occupying force commander, as this 2-star general, I owned all of northern Iraq, certainly of Nainawa province, of which Mosul is the capital. And I was the executive, legislative, and judicial all in one, until we eventually got some interim and then actual governance established. And it was actually that graduate school experience that, again, it taught me that there are seriously bright people in the world that don't see it at all similar to the way we do. And you've not got to figure out how to find common ground, how to communicate with them, how to discuss, how to debate, and what are some very basic ideas when it comes to political philosophy and to economics of all things. Because, again, we were basically reviving a country, the top echelons of which had all been demolished and which the rest had disintegrated. So hugely significant, I think. And for what it's worth, on the mentorship side, I was the benefit of incredible mentorship, including the individual who suggested that I go to graduate school by asking me. I had two choices. I could go to the Ranger Regiment, more infantry, light infantry, special ops, or I could go to graduate school. And so, it's the Rangers or Princeton. And he asked me, have you ever considered raising your intellectual sights farther than the maximum effective range of an M60 machine gun? And, I got the point. And so I went to graduate school, and it really made just an enormous difference in my life. There are lots of other benefits from that, including relationships, even a credential, frankly, for a military person sometimes just got you credit with those who don't recognize the credentials of rank or ranger tabs or any of this other stuff. So it turned out to be absolutely crucial. And for what it's worth, I have tried to be a mentor as well ever since, as you get to a point where folks actually welcome a bit of advice and assistance and everything else, and have thoroughly enjoyed giving it back because of the extraordinary mentors that I was privileged to have during my career. A number of very, very prominent individuals that again were of enormous value during that time. And I think mentorship should be sought by people that are trying to progress and trying to determine how they should proceed, what path they should take. And having that kind of advice and assistance at times can be absolutely invaluable.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma, and please don't forget to visit our website at tnsr.org.